August 16, 1943, Kiska Island, Alaska Territory. The fog was so thick a man could press his palm against it and feel nothing but cold. Private First Class Leonard Holleran of the 1st Special Service Force moved in a crouch through the gray nothing, his M1 carbine leveled at a world he couldn't see. 3 hours into the island's interior, his patrol had cataloged the things you find when an army leaves in a hurry: shell casings scattered in the tundra, abandoned fighting positions still lined with sandbags, ammunition crates stacked and untouched. The detritus of 5,000 men who had been here were no longer here and had left their traces with the particular carelessness of people who had not been planning to go. Where are they? The thought ran on a loop. Where in the hell are the Japanese? He wasn't alone in asking. All across Kiska's volcanic hills that morning, 34,426 American and Canadian soldiers were moving through the same fog, expecting the same battle. They had trained for months. They had assembled 100 warships. For 3 weeks straight, every flyable day that the Aleutian weather permitted, the 11th Air Force and the Navy had saturated this island with bombs and naval shells. Pre-invasion intelligence placed the garrison at somewhere between 5,200 and 5,600 entrenched soldiers. Every planner in every briefing room from a dock to Washington had modeled their casualty projections on Attu. Attu had been 19 days of fighting so savage that in proportion to the troops engaged, it ranked second only to Iwo Jima in the Pacific. 549 Americans killed, 1,148 wounded, another 1,200 evacuated for exposure and frostbite alone. The Japanese garrison of approximately 2,500 had been eliminated almost to the last man, with only 28 taken prisoner. Their commander, Colonel Yasuio Yamasaki, had led the surviving remnant in a final banzai charge and died in the assault. Of 2,500 Japanese on Attu, 28 came home alive. For Kiska, the planners had anticipated worse. The garrison was larger, the defenses more elaborate. The island had had 14 months of preparation. Senior commanders used the phrase "another Attu" and added the qualifier, "but bigger." There was nobody to fight. The Japanese had been gone for 18 days. By mid-morning, on August 16th, patrols from the northern and southern sectors converged on the main Japanese encampment at Kiska Harbor and confirmed what the silence had been saying since the first landing craft ground ashore. But there it was, proof that changed everything. Before we continue, please support us with a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Now back to what they found. The message radioed back to reserve forces waiting at Amchitka Island was deliberately mundane, a coded phrase that contained within its civilian ordinariness one of the most startling military discoveries of the entire Pacific War: "Baby needs a new pair of shoes." The most meticulously planned assault in Aleutian history had found coffee cups still on tables, dogs wandering the tundra, 3 disabled Japanese ships beached in the harbor like monuments to a hasty departure. A garrison of more than 5,000 men had evaporated as completely as the fog that had shielded their escape. The 34,000 soldiers who had braced for the bloodbath of their lives now stood in the silence of an island that had become, in the space of a few weeks, something far more dangerous than a defended fortress. It had become a trap set by people who were no longer there to spring it. The Japanese hadn't surrendered Kiska. They had handed it over, carefully, with malice aforethought. And what they left behind would kill Americans for weeks. The occupation of Kiska had begun on the morning of June 6, 1942, with an act of almost theatrical efficiency. Roughly 550 Marines of the 3rd Special Naval Landing Force came ashore at Reynard Cove under the command of Captain Takeji Ono. They met no resistance. The only American military presence on the entire island was a 10-man Navy weather detachment and one of their dogs. The Japanese killed 2 of those men and captured 7 others, sending them to Japan as prisoners. Chief Petty Officer William C. House managed to escape into the tundra and evade capture for 50 days before surrender became his only remaining option. Reduced to eating plants and worms, he weighed just 80 pounds when he finally gave himself up. He was the sole member of that weather detachment to make it off the island on his own terms, although terms is a generous word for anything that happened on Kiska. The occupation, executed simultaneously with Japan's seizure of neighboring Attu Island, was the first time in over a century that a foreign military force controlled American territory. The Aleutian landings were partly strategic and partly diversionary, designed to draw American attention northward during the broader assault on Midway. But after Midway collapsed into catastrophe for the Imperial Japanese Navy, the General Staff decided to hold the Aleutians anyway. The two desolate, fog-shrouded islands became a matter of national prestige. Surrendering them would mean surrendering the only piece of American soil Japan had managed to take. So Japan decided to build something worth holding. On July 1, 1942, a second wave of 1,200 naval troops arrived at Kiska Harbor along with a large quantity of war material, including gun batteries originally earmarked for the occupation of Midway. The garrison, which would eventually grow to over 6,800 personnel at its peak, set to work constructing a military installation whose sophistication would later astonish Allied intelligence analysts. They dug tunnels through the volcanic rock, not shallow earthworks, but genuine underground infrastructure for underground hospitals, ammunition magazines, command posts, and air raid shelters. They built machine shops capable of manufacturing replacement parts, a power station with its own generating equipment, a sawmill, and a water distribution system complete with fire hydrants installed at the main encampment. Coastal defense batteries went up on North Head, anchored by a 4.7-inch gun whose range covered the harbor approaches. In the valley behind the main camp, a battery of 75mm Type 88 anti-aircraft guns, capable of a rate of fire of 20 rounds per minute with an effective ceiling of 22,000 feet, was emplaced in positions that could be rapidly collapsed onto a one-axle trailer for repositioning. Seaplane ramps were constructed on the harbor's northern shore. A submarine base took shape at Trout Lagoon. Dummy defensive positions were scattered across the island to confuse aerial reconnaissance. When Army troops arrived from neighboring Attu in September 1942 to reinforce the Navy garrison, the Army protecting Gertrude Cove on the island's southern reaches while the Navy held the harbor, the construction expanded further. Permanent barracks replaced tents. The tunnel network extended. By late 1942, the Japanese had assembled 105 heavy and medium artillery pieces on Kiska, ranging in caliber from 4.7-inch up to 8-inch guns, many of them sighted with the professional care of engineers who had studied the island's terrain in detail. What they never completed was the airfield on North Head. Without heavy engineering equipment, without the bulldozers and graders that American construction battalions would eventually bring, the Japanese labor force could clear ground and begin grading, but they could not build a runway capable of supporting combat aircraft. The volcanic tundra defeated them. The ground that looked stable compressed under load, waterlogged, and shifted. The persistent fog and Aleutian winds disrupted systematic work. The airfield that would have given the Kiska garrison its own air cover remained until the evacuation, a patch of cleared and roughly graded earth on the island's northern promontory, the bones of a project that the weather and the soil had conspired to defeat. The Allies were doing their part to slow the work. From the day after the initial landing, when an American patrol plane spotted Japanese ships in Kiska Harbor on June 8, 1942, the 11th Air Force and the Navy subjected Kiska to a sustained bombardment campaign. More than 6 million pounds of bombs fell on the island over the course of the occupation. American submarines torpedoed Japanese destroyers in the harbor approaches. Naval surface forces ran periodic bombardment missions. Shipping attempting to resupply the garrison paid a heavy price. The oiler Nissan Maru sunk in June 1942, the troop ship Nozima Maru in September, the steamer Borneo Maru in October, the destroyer Oboro in October, the submarine Ro-65 in November. The list of lost vessels stretched through 1942 and into 1943. The problem was that none of it decisively undermined the garrison. The Japanese tunnels absorbed bombardment. The gun emplacements, dispersed and hardened, survived strike after strike. The weather cooperated with the defenders. In July 1943, only 12 days of aerial bombardment were even possible. Aircraft attempting to bomb Kiska in marginal visibility, which was most of the time, crashed into the Aleutian Mountains or the Pacific with greater frequency than they were hit by anti-aircraft fire. The island's fog and geography were, in the most literal sense, doing more defensive work than any artillery battery the Japanese had installed. By early 1943, Allied commanders had concluded that there was no air campaign intensive enough to crack Kiska without a ground assault. The question wasn't whether they would invade, it was only when and at what cost. The March 26, 1943 Battle of the Komandorsky Islands effectively ended Japanese attempts to resupply Kiska and Attu by surface convoy. 2 Japanese cruisers were damaged in the engagement. Rear Admiral Hosogaya broke contact and withdrew rather than close with the American force, and Imperial General Headquarters subsequently forbade further surface resupply runs. From that point, only submarines could reach the Aleutian garrisons. Submarines were not enough. After Attu fell on May 30, 1943, Imperial General Headquarters faced an arithmetic problem with no good answer. Kiska held over 5,000 men. Submarines could extract perhaps 20 to 30 at a time under favorable conditions. Even running at full pace, the submarine extraction effort removed only 820 personnel before the losses. At least 3 Japanese submarines sunk in waters around Kiska in June 1943 alone, made further missions prohibitively costly. At that rate, full extraction would take years. Japan had weeks. Tokyo made the decision that Attu had made obvious. They would not sacrifice the Kiska garrison in a pointless final stand. What happened on Attu, where 2,351 Japanese dead were buried in mass graves and only 28 men came out as prisoners, was not going to happen on Kiska. Operation KE would extract the entire garrison by surface fleet, using the one weapon Japan still possessed in the North Pacific, the Aleutian fog. The man assigned to execute this was Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, given command of the 1st Destroyer Squadron on June 11, 1943. Kimura was a veteran torpedo officer who had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1910, survived the disaster of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, where American air power had systematically annihilated a Japanese convoy force, and understood precisely how improbable what he was being asked to accomplish actually was. He needed to move a surface task force approximately 800 miles from its base at Paramushiro in the Kuril Islands, penetrate an Allied naval blockade, enter a harbor covered by American radar, load more than 5,000 soldiers onto ships in darkness and fog, and depart without being detected. He assembled his force with care. 2 light cruisers, the Abukuma and the Kiso, would provide the backbone. 10 destroyers were assigned. Among them was the Shimakaze, the newest and fastest destroyer in the Japanese fleet, selected specifically because she was equipped with radar, the only Japanese destroyer of her generation to carry it, and invaluable for navigating through zero-visibility Aleutian fog. Kimura ran his crews through loading drills at Paramushiro Bay in thick fog, practicing embarkation under radio silence, communicating between ships by horn signals and carefully shielded signal lance. Every minute of loading time that could be shaved in training was a minute less of vulnerability at Kiska. He needed 2 failed attempts before the weather gave him his window. On July 7th, the force made its first approach. The fog they were counting on as cover lifted at the worst possible moment, threatening visibility that would expose the fleet to aerial observation. Kimura turned back. On July 21st, the task force sorted again, approached within range of the island, and found the clouds breaking over the harbor. A second withdrawal, this one more demoralizing than the first, because the garrison troops had marched to the embarkation point and then turned back once already. Men who had been marching to the harbor every night, waiting and returning to their positions before dawn, were running short on the kind of faith that keeps soldiers functional. What finally cracked open the window for Kimura was an error by the enemy. On July 26th, American radar operators aboard the battleships USS Mississippi and USS Idaho picked up contact approximately 80 miles west of Kiska, what appeared on their screens to be a fleet of enemy vessels. The battleships opened fire, expending 518 shells over the following 2 hours. They struck nothing. The radar had been painting weather formations, bands of precipitation dense enough to produce strong false returns. This engagement, later dubbed the Battle of the Pips, was a significant embarrassment for the American Naval Command, but its immediate consequence was more important. The destroyers that had been holding their blockade positions were pulled away to investigate, then dispatched to refuel, leaving a gap in the cordon around Kiska just as Kimura was preparing his third attempt. On July 28th, the task force departed Paramushiro. The fog that the bombing campaigns had cursed, that had grounded aircraft and fouled radar and frustrated months of operations, now did its most consequential work of the entire campaign. Kimura's fleet navigated the northern approach to Kiska through shoal water and uncharted rocks, waters that American commanders had assessed as too hazardous for fleet operations, using the Shimakaze's radar to thread through the darkness. The ships dropped anchor in Kiska Harbor at 15:30 hours on July 29th. What followed was a masterpiece of organized desperation. The garrison had been standing by for 6 hours, marching to the embarkation points in small groups to avoid attracting aerial observation. Now, as the ships anchored, the movement became a controlled flood. 10 landing craft from the island and 12 from the task force worked simultaneously, shuttling men from the beach to the waiting ships. Soldiers abandoned everything: artillery, vehicles, personal gear, food still cooking on fires, equipment they had spent months building and maintaining. They ran. In 55 minutes, 5,183 men were loaded onto the cruisers and destroyers. By the time Kimura's fleet cleared Kiska Harbor and turned north into the fog, no American aircraft or surface vessel had reported anything unusual. The entire garrison reached Paramushiro safely on August 1st. Not a man was lost in the extraction. On July 28th, American Signals Intelligence noted that radio transmissions from Kiska had stopped. Analysts observed unrepaired bomb damage in aerial photographs. They reported anti-aircraft guns that had ceased firing. Some intelligence officers argued, correctly, that the garrison appeared to be gone. The word was brought to commanders who reviewed the evidence and concluded that the Japanese were withdrawing to prepared defensive positions, hiding their strength, baiting the invaders, preparing an ambush. The bombing continued for 16 more days. 34,426 soldiers prepared to storm a ghost. The Allied landing force came ashore on August 15th into the silence and the fog, which was itself a kind of message nobody could read yet. Kiska was exactly what it had always been: 22 miles long, up to 6 miles wide, its spine a ridge of volcanic peaks reaching above 4,000 feet, its lower slopes covered in the sodden, ankle-wrenching tundra that the Aleutians produced in such reliable quantity. Visibility in the harbor that morning was measured in yards. The first waves moved inland into a gray that swallowed men whole. The 1st Special Service Force, the elite American-Canadian Commando Unit completing its first combat deployment, landed in the initial assault waves and pushed toward the interior. Behind them came successive waves of infantry from the U.S. Army's 7th and 87th Mountain Infantry Divisions, alongside Canadian Army forces. Spread across 22 miles of fog-shrouded volcanic landscape, with no visual landmarks and no enemy to orient against, 34,000 soldiers became, functionally, a very large number of people who could not see each other. The fog and the expectation of combat combined to produce the outcome that fog and expectation have always produced. On August 15th, as American units pushed north through the interior and Canadian units moved up from the south, the two forces converged in near-zero visibility without establishing communication. Sounds of movement through the tundra, shapes in the gray, the noise of boots on volcanic scree produced the reflexive response of soldiers who had been told for weeks that they were walking into a defended position. A Canadian patrol opened fire on American lines. The Americans returned fire on the Canadians. By the time the shooting stopped, 28 Americans and 4 Canadians were dead, with 50 more wounded on both sides. On an island from which the Japanese had been gone for 18 days, the first casualty list was written entirely by Allied soldiers shooting at each other through fog. The mines were the next education. The Japanese had spent the days before their evacuation with a specific purpose, transforming the island they were abandoning into the most lethal, undefended piece of ground in the Pacific theater. Working from a plan that must have been prepared well in advance, the speed of the evacuation would have allowed no time for improvisation. They seeded the island with ordnance in a pattern designed to kill the people who came to take it. Naval mines had been laid in the harbor approaches, not merely the fixed defensive fields already charted by Allied intelligence, but loose mines allowed to drift on the harbor currents, moving with the tides into positions that would be uncharted by definition. Around the garrison encampments and along the trails connecting them, landmines were pressed into the volcanic tundra, pressure-detonated devices planted below the surface, indistinguishable from the rocky soil beneath every soldier's boots. Booby traps were rigged inside buildings with professional craft, tripwires across doorways at ankle height, weighted objects that, when moved, completed circuits wired to explosive charges. Items that looked abandoned, tools, equipment, cases of supplies, were wired to detonate when picked up. The Japanese engineers who set these devices knew their trade. They had designed them specifically for the behavior of soldiers entering and searching an abandoned position. Allied engineers who began clearing the island found themselves solving a puzzle that had no map and whose edges they could not reliably define. Mine-clearing teams moved through the tundra in methodical grid sweeps, probing the ground with rods, but the fog that accumulated and dispersed in unpredictable cycles disrupted systematic search patterns, obscured the sight lines needed to maintain formation, and compressed the useful working day to whatever visibility allowed. Ground that a team had swept carefully in the morning could look entirely different in the afternoon. The island's drainage was poor. Rain pooled in the tundra's hollows and covered sections of ground that might or might not have been cleared. 4 soldiers were killed by booby traps during the sweep. Hundreds more suffered trench foot from the water-saturated ground. At 0150 on August 18th, the Fletcher-class destroyer USS Abner Reed was conducting anti-submarine patrol off Kiska, when, executing a full right rudder turn, she detonated a floating Japanese mine against her port quarter. The explosion was heard by crews on ships miles distant. It tore away the entire stern section at frame 170, 75 feet of warship, cleanly separated by a single detonation. The blast force straightened the aluminum bunk hooks in the aft compartments, bent the propeller shafts, and drove choking chemical smoke from the ship's damaged generators flooding through the interior of what remained. Crewmen sleeping in aft bunks went into the water in seconds. Approximately 90 men were in the stern section when it separated and sank. Rescue operations pulled roughly 20 from the oil-slicked water. The USS Bancroft arrived and took the surviving bow section under tow. Eventually, USS Ute pulled it to Adak for emergency repairs. 71 sailors died. Another 47 were wounded. The Abner Reed had struck a mine left by a garrison that was already safe at Paramushiro, a weapon that had no remaining army to serve, no defensive line to protect, no objective except killing the Americans who would inevitably come. It worked exactly as designed. Major General Charles Corlett declared Kiska secured on August 24, 1943. The final accounting for Operation Cottage, an assault on an island occupied by no enemy soldiers, reached somewhere between 200 and 313 casualties, depending on how the count was made and which service recorded it. Friendly fire dead, booby trap deaths, the sailors lost on the Abner Reed, exposure and accident casualties on an island where the weather claimed its own toll regardless of the enemy situation. The ghost island had fought without a single defender present. Now someone had to build on it. The strategic argument for Kiska was simple enough from a map. The island sat near the western end of the Aleutian chain, approximately 900 miles from the Kuril Islands, Japan's northern home island chain. An operational airfield on Kiska placed medium bombers within reach of targets that had previously required extraordinary round-trip distances from bases further east. The 11th Air Force had already demonstrated the concept. On July 10, 1943, 8 B-25 Mitchells from A-2 flew the first American air raid on Japanese home territory since the Doolittle raid of April 1942, striking targets on the Kuril Island of Shumshu. Those raids required a round trip of nearly 1,800 miles from A-2. From Kiska, that distance shortened by roughly 150 miles. More importantly, Kiska's harbor offered logistics capacity that the smaller A-2 facilities lacked. In the broader Pacific War calculus, the northern axis, Alaska to the Aleutians to the Kurils, represented a line of pressure the Japanese could not dismiss. Every base the Americans consolidated in the Aleutians forced Japan to divert forces to the northern defense of its home islands. Those were forces not available for Guadalcanal, the Solomons, New Guinea, or wherever the next American thrust materialized. A base on Kiska was, in this sense, worth more than its direct bombing radius implied. The men assigned to build it were the Naval Construction Battalions, the Seabees. By the summer of 1943, the Aleutian Theater hosted the largest concentration of Seabee strength anywhere in the Pacific. From a single construction battalion in early 1942, Seabee numbers in Alaska had grown to over 20,000 men and 500 officers by January 1944. The theater had already produced 2 firsts for the Naval Construction Force. The 1st Naval Construction Regiment formed in the Pacific stood up at Dutch Harbor in September 1942, and the 1st Naval Construction Brigade formed in the Pacific was organized at Adak in May 1943. The Aleutian Campaign was, in a real sense, the proving ground where the Seabees learned what they could actually do under conditions that tested every premise they had arrived with. Those conditions were specific and relentless. The Aleutians receive approximately 200 days of fog, rain, or overcast per year. Summer temperatures regularly hover in the 30s. The Williwaw, the violent, localized katabatic downdraft unique to the island chain, could arrive without barometric warning, sustaining hurricane-force gusts capable of overturning unsecured equipment, collapsing tent structures, and grounding any aircraft that happened to be airborne when it hit. The volcanic tundra that covered the island's lower slopes behaved unlike any construction surface engineers trained in continental America had encountered. It looked solid and stable until heavy equipment moved across it, at which point it compressed, saturated, and turned to something between bog and quicksand. The Seabees had been solving these problems for a year before they arrived on Kiska. The most instructive case was Adak Island, 250 miles to the east. In August 1942, Army engineers of the 807th Aviation Engineering Battalion had landed on a tidal flat at Adak and built a fighter strip in 10 days. The site was partially flooded when they arrived. They worked through it. Without that Adak strip, the bombing campaign against Kiska could never have been sustained. The distances from bases further east were simply too great. The Aleutian Campaign was, from its first days, a campaign built on engineering that refused to wait for favorable conditions. What the Seabees found on Kiska when they arrived was simultaneously an advantage and a hazard. The advantage was the Japanese construction itself. 14 months of work by a garrison of over 6,000 had produced genuine infrastructure, tunnel systems that could be repurposed for American use, cleared ground around the harbor encampment, and most critically, the partially graded airfield site on North Head. The Japanese had started the work the Seabees needed to finish. The graded earth on North Head was not a runway. The Japanese had never solved the tundra problem well enough to surface it, but it was a beginning. The clearing and rough grading that had been done could be built upon. The hazard was everything else. The 105 artillery pieces left behind were documented and secured, but the minefields were a different category of problem entirely. Unlike the artillery, visible, fixed, locatable, the mines and booby traps existed in a landscape that yielded no external clues about what lay beneath it. Mine-clearing teams could not work efficiently in fog. They could not work systematically when visibility closed to a few meters. They could not guarantee that a cleared section had been comprehensively swept when drainage and tundra disturbance might have moved objects between the sweep and the follow-up confirmation. The clearing operation and the construction operation had to share the same ground simultaneously, which meant every work crew operating a piece of heavy machinery was doing so on terrain that might contain ordnance in conditions where the warning might be the explosion itself. This is the principle the Seabees brought to Kiska that no formal doctrine could fully capture. The work continues regardless of the conditions, because waiting for favorable conditions in the Aleutians means not working. The Army engineers who built the Adak Strip had done it in a flooded tidal flat in 10 days. The Seabees, who had extended the base chain westward through 1943, had built roads, piers, fuel depots, and runways in weather that regularly grounded the aircraft those facilities were built to serve. The Kiska assignment was extreme even by those standards. Construction on mined ground, in unpredictable fog, on unstable volcanic tundra, in the institutional shadow of an invasion that had just cost over 200 casualties against no defending army. But the basic approach was the one the Aleutian theater had been developing for a year. The enabling technology was Marston matting, the perforated steel plank system developed before the war for rapid temporary runway construction. A full airfield's worth of Marston mat could be loaded into a single cargo hold of a Liberty ship and unloaded ready for use. On stable ground, it could be in place and ready for aircraft to land within 72 hours. On Kiska's volcanic tundra, where proper grading was a multi-week project that the weather would interrupt repeatedly, Marston matting distributed aircraft load across an unstable surface in a way that no solid paving could manage quickly enough. The existing Japanese groundwork on North Head provided the foundation. The matting would provide the surface. The 119th Army Airways Communications Squadron established a communications facility at the Kiska Airfield site on August 25, 1943, one day after General Corlett declared the island secured, while mine-clearing teams were still working through the surrounding tundra. That sequence captures the essential quality of construction work in the Aleutian theater. The operational requirement didn't wait for the environment to become safe. The signal facility went up while the ground around it was still being cleared. Construction on the airfield at North Head proceeded through the fall with the rhythm that the Aleutian Islands imposed on all operations. Windows of reasonable visibility measured in hours, not days. Equipment that required constant maintenance against the corrosive combination of salt air, freezing temperatures, and perpetual moisture. Work schedules shaped by the weather forecast that the 11th Air Force meteorological units issued each morning, knowing that their predictions were educated guesses in a climate that punished overconfidence. The bulldozer operators working the North Head site had a particular relationship with their machines that no peacetime job could have produced. A blade moving through Aleutian tundra encountered volcanic rock, root mats, permafrost lens, pooled water, and, on Kiska, the possibility of a pressure mechanism set by Japanese engineers now safely at Paramushiro. The difference between scraping volcanic rock and contacting a mine pressure plate was, in the moment, nothing. Both produced metallic resistance against the blade. Equipment operators learned to listen with the specific attention of men who understood that the ground beneath them had been deliberately prepared to kill people working it. The Williwaw was the other adversary no training manual had adequately described. A standard Aleutian weather brief would note fog, wind 15 to 25 knots, Williwaw possible, meaning that at some indeterminate point, a violent katabatic downdraft might arrive without barometric warning, sustained wind speeds capable of tipping a loaded truck, and dissipate as abruptly as it arrived. Seabee crew chiefs responded with doctrine, equipment anchored between shifts, matting stockpiles staked and tied, tent structures given ground anchoring that would have seemed paranoid anywhere else. In the Aleutians, it was standard practice. The airfield at North Head was surfaced with Marston matting on the former Japanese foundation. The runway extended and formalized beyond what the original Japanese clearing had accomplished. Harbor facilities were developed to support air operations and the logistics chain the base required: fuel storage, ammunition handling, maintenance facilities for transiting aircraft. The Japanese tunnel system, cleared and documented by Army engineers, was repurposed for storage and shelter. What the Japanese garrison had spent 14 months building as a defensive installation, the Seabees converted into a forward operating base in weeks. There was no single dramatic build, no race against a deadline, no moment where everything hung on one decision. There was instead the accumulation of days, shifts worked in fog, equipment repaired and returned to service, sections of tundra probed and cleared before the Marston mat went down on them. By mid-September 1943, the Kiska airfield was operational. Aircraft were transiting through it. The northern road to Japan, the one the Attu bombers had opened on July 10th, was now supported by a second base further west, extending range and reducing the logistics burden on the Attu facilities. The Japanese, who had built Kiska to anchor the northern perimeter of their empire, had instead provided the foundations for the base that would help dismantle it. The island's broader strategic effect was felt through the commitment it forced from the Imperial Japanese military. By the end of 1943, Japanese air strength in the Kuril Islands and Hokkaido had grown to approximately 260 aircraft, roughly 15% of Japan's total air strength, held in the north to defend against the Aleutian-based bombing threat. Those were 260 aircraft not available for the defense of the Solomons, New Guinea, or the Central Pacific atolls where the decisive battles of the war's latter years were already beginning. The Aleutian Campaign, dismissed as the "forgotten battle" by most Pacific War historians, had tied down a significant fraction of Japanese defensive air power for over a year, a strategic dividend paid for in part by the engineers who built runways in fog on mined volcanic islands. The Japanese were certain the Aleutian environment was their ultimate fortress. They were wrong about what the environment was a fortress against. Operation KE, Japanese evacuation, July 28 to August 1, 1943. Personnel evacuated, 5,183 soldiers and naval personnel in a single operation. Evacuation time in harbor, 55 minutes. Task Force, Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, 2 light cruisers, Abukuma and Kiso, 10 destroyers including radar-equipped Shimakaze. Prior submarine evacuation, approximately 820 personnel removed before losses halted submarine missions. Transit distance one way, Paramushiro to Kiska, approximately 800 miles. Fleet reached Paramushiro safely August 1st. Operation Cottage, Allied invasion, August 15th to 24th, 1943. Forces committed, 34,426 American and Canadian troops, staging from Adak, 250 miles east, supported by 100 Allied warships. Pre-invasion bombardment, Allied aerial attacks continued for 16 days after Japanese evacuation completed July 29th. 11th Air Force dropped over 6 million pounds of bombs on Kiska during the full occupation period. Duration of secured operation, August 24, 1943, declared secured by Major General Charles Corlett. Casualties, against 0 Japanese defenders. Friendly fire dead, 28 Americans, 4 Canadians, 50 additional wounded. Killed by Japanese booby traps, 4. USS Abner Reed mine strike August 18, 0150 hours, 71 killed, 47 wounded. 75-foot stern section severed and sunk in approximately 290 feet of water. Trench foot, exposure, accidental injuries, 100+ additional casualties. Total Operation Cottage, approximately 200 to 313, sources vary. Intelligence failure. Allied analysts correctly identified signs of Japanese withdrawal beginning late July. Signals ceased July 28. Commanders assessed withdrawal as defensive repositioning. Bombardment continued. No American aircraft or surface vessel detected Kimura's fleet during extraction. Seabees and Engineer Strength in the Aleutian Theater. 1st Naval Construction Regiment in the Pacific, formed Dutch Harbor, September 1942. 1st Naval Construction Brigade in the Pacific, formed Adak, May 1943. Total Seabees strength in Alaska by January 1944, 20,000 plus enlisted, 500 plus officers. Strategic dividend. 1st 11th Air Force raid on Japanese home territory, July 10, 1943, from Attu, 8 B-25s attacking Shumshu, Kuril Islands. Japanese defensive air strength committed to the Kurils, Hokkaido by late 1943, approximately 260 aircraft, roughly 15% of total Japanese air strength held in place by the Aleutian threat. In July 2018, a research team aboard the survey vessel Norseman II located the Abner Reed's missing stern on the ocean floor, 290 feet down in the gray water off Kiska. The 75-foot section had been there for 75 years, still classified under federal law as a war grave, still carrying the remains of sailors who never came up. It is the most precise monument the Kiska campaign produced, a piece of a warship destroyed by a weapon set against an army that was already gone, resting in water around an island that remains uninhabited and is rarely visited, designated a National Historic Landmark in 1985, and largely unknown outside the small community of historians who study the war's forgotten margins. What Kiska left embedded in American military doctrine was not what the planners expected to learn. Attu had taught them about the cost of assault and the certainty of Japanese resistance. Kiska taught something more unsettling, that the most dangerous failure mode in military intelligence is not the absence of information, but the persistence of assumption. The analysts who correctly read the signs of Japanese withdrawal in late July 1943, the ceased radio transmissions, the unrepaired bomb damage, the silent anti-aircraft batteries, were right. They were overruled by commanders who could not relinquish the mental model they had built. 34,000 soldiers crossed the North Pacific to assault an empty island because no one in the decision chain could bring themselves to believe the evidence that was in front of them. The lesson would not be learned quickly. 4 months later, American planners assaulting Tarawa in the Gilbert Islands assumed their pre-invasion bombardment had neutralized the Japanese defensive positions. It had not. The pattern of intelligence filtered through assumption, of evidence bent to fit the expected narrative, would recur throughout the Pacific campaign, costing lives wherever it appeared. For the Seabees who built on Kiska's remnants, none of that strategic calculus was present in the day-to-day work. They knew the island was mined. They knew the fog would return every day, and the Williwaw might arrive at any hour. They knew they were building on ground that had already demonstrated its willingness to kill the people working it. They built anyway because the alternative, waiting for the Aleutians to become hospitable, was not available to anyone trying to win a war. That willingness would carry the naval construction battalions to every beach assault in the Pacific's last 2 years. At Saipan and Guam, Seabees landed in the assault waves to begin airfield construction under fire. At Iwo Jima, bulldozers were working within hours of the initial landing, while fighting continued on 3 sides. At Okinawa, the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War, construction battalions operated airstrip surfaces that aircraft needed before the island was secure. The specific knowledge that made this possible, that construction could happen simultaneously with combat, that the distinction between a construction site and a battlefield was administrative rather than physical, that the work continued regardless of what was happening around it, had been developed in the Aleutian Theater, on islands where the weather killed more Americans than the Japanese did. The Ghost Island had been the test case. Kiska is still uninhabited. The tundra still covers the 75mm Type 88 anti-aircraft guns, which remain in their original positions, too heavy to move and too remote to bother. The tunnel systems the Japanese carved through the volcanic rock are still there, accessible to the wildlife researchers who occasionally receive permits to visit the Alaskan Maritime National Wildlife Refuge that now covers the island. Unexploded ordnance is still present in the ground. The mine-clearing operation that preceded the Seabees construction was thorough but not complete. The Aleutians are patient about these things. The Japanese believed the environment they had mastered for 14 months would stop the Americans who came to replace them. They were right that Kiska was hostile. They were right that the fog, the Williwaw, and the volcanic tundra were genuine adversaries. What they had not correctly estimated was the particular quality of the men who would be sent to work in it regardless. Engineers who had learned, on a chain of fog-shrouded volcanic islands stretching across the North Pacific, that the work does not wait for the world to become easier. The ghost island had a new owner. They had earned it.